What does it mean to disappear at the exact moment the world seems about to widen? History remembers certain explorers not only for where they went, but for the silence that followed them. A last letter, a final radio call, a line in a journal written with a steady hand, then no hand at all. Again and again, the pattern returns. Someone moves beyond the edge of the known, glimpses something they can barely name, and then is gone before the story can be finished. We like to imagine discovery as a clean act. A map is updated, a specimen is labeled, a camera captures proof. But real discovery is often messier than that. It begins in rumor, in instinct, in half-seen forms at the edge of the firelight. It asks people to trust faint signals, a carved symbol, an old legend, a strange formation beneath ice, the sense that a landscape is hiding more than it reveals. Sometimes the searcher returns with evidence. Sometimes the landscape keeps both the secret and the one who sought it. These are not simply stories about adventure, they are stories about human longing, about the hunger to know what came before us, what lies beneath us, what waits in the blank spaces where certainty runs out. Jungles, deserts, caves, rivers, mountains, frozen fields of white, they become more than settings. They become mirrors, reflecting our oldest desire, to believe that the world is still deeper than our explanations. And yet these vanishings also leave a quieter question behind. Was it ambition that carried these people too far, or wonder? Did they chase answers, or did they follow something more intimate, the hope that one true discovery might make a life feel complete? Perhaps that is where every journey in this story begins, not with proof, but with a voice saying, almost in a whisper, there is something here. What if the map's blank spaces were never empty at all, only waiting for someone stubborn enough to believe in them? In the early decades of the 20th century, the Amazon still existed in the Western imagination as both a place and a dare. It was a green immensity, humid and unreadable, where rivers twisted like thought, and entire worlds could vanish beneath the canopy. For Colonel Percy Fawcett, it was more than wilderness. It was an argument with modern certainty. Fawcett had spent years moving through South America as a surveyor, listening as much as he measured. He heard stories from indigenous communities, old colonial accounts, rumors of stone ruins hidden far from the known routes. To many of his contemporaries, these were fantasies shaped by heat and distance. But Fawcett believed the jungle was keeping the memory of a lost civilization, something organized, intelligent, and old enough to embarrass the arrogance of empire. By 1925, that belief had hardened into purpose. He set out with his son Jack and Jack's friend Raleigh Rymel, carrying limited supplies and a confidence that now feels almost spiritual. His last message was not the language of a man turning back. It was the voice of someone who thought he had reached the threshold. The city, he suggested, was near. Local accounts pointed east. Tomorrow, they would go on. Then the forest closed behind them. No verified trace of the three men returned. Search parties followed. Some died trying. Decades passed, and the silence only deepened. Yet later, archaeology would reveal that the Amazon had indeed sheltered complex pre-Columbian societies, complete with engineered landscapes and geometric earthworks. In that sense, Fawcett may not have been chasing a myth at all. He may simply have been too early and too alone. There is something haunting in that possibility. Not that he vanished while pursuing illusion, but that he disappeared while moving toward a truth no one around him was ready to accept. How often does the world hide its answers inside places we first dismiss as impossible? It began, as many disappearances do, with weather and confidence. In 1937, Amelia Earhart was already one of the most recognized figures on Earth, not simply because she could fly, but because she had transformed flight into a language of possibility. To some, she represented glamour. To others, discipline. To many women, watching from ordinary lives, she looked like proof that the horizon was not fixed. Her final journey was meant to circle the globe, a feat of endurance, navigation, and public imagination. By then, air travel still carried the texture of risk. The sky was not yet routine. Distances over ocean remained fragile equations of fuel, radio contact, cloud cover, and human judgment. Earhart, with navigator Fred Noonan, moved eastward across continents and islands until the trip narrowed toward its most unforgiving stretch, the Pacific, wide as a thought too large to hold. Somewhere near Howland Island, the mission unraveled. The radio transmissions that survive are thin and unsettling. Earhart reported that they were close, then uncertain, then flying along a line while searching. Static, fragments, repetition. It is the sound of knowledge slipping, of instruments and geography refusing to meet. From the ground, operators listened for her voice and could do almost nothing with it. The modern world was present, engines, frequencies, mapped targets, yet the old helplessness remained. A tiny aircraft, a vast ocean, a margin of error measured in minutes, then nothing. Theories multiplied in the silence: crash and sink, island landing, capture, survival. Over time, her disappearance became a magnet for projection, as if the absence itself demanded invention. But beneath the speculation is something much more human and much sadder. A woman who had spent her life mastering distance may have been undone by one final gap too small to see and too large to recover from. That may be why her story endures. Not because it offers answers, but because it reveals how thin the line can be between mastery and mystery. We build machines to outrun our limits, yet sometimes the world reminds us that courage is not the same thing as control. Imagine a raft no larger than a room, cut loose upon the Atlantic, carrying one man toward a question no instrument could fully answer. In 1969, British explorer John Fairfax pushed away from the Canary Islands with the intention of rowing alone across the ocean. It sounds, even now, like an act balanced between discipline and obsession. There would be no engine to rescue him from fatigue, no crew to absorb the loneliness, only his body, the sea, and the idea that a human being could endure vastness by accepting its rhythm rather than conquering it. For months, that rhythm became his world. The days were made of repetition: pull, breathe, correct, wait. The nights brought black water and the feeling that the earth had quietly disappeared. Storms struck with the indifference of weather over open sea, and the raft, for all its clever design, remained heartbreakingly small against them. Fairfax faced hunger, exhaustion, salt sores, and the mental distortion that comes when silence stretches too long. Yet he kept going, measuring progress in stubborn increments, trusting that persistence itself could become a kind of navigation. Then came the moment that makes endurance stories feel almost unreal. After more than 100 days on the ocean, he was found near exhaustion, drifting within reach of survival, yet nearly surrendered to the elements. He had not vanished forever, but he had crossed into a place where disappearance felt close enough to breathe. The line between triumph and oblivion had narrowed to a handful of days, perhaps hours. And that is what lingers. Not merely that he survived, but that the journey revealed how fragile the word survive can be. We tend to imagine explorers as people moving toward landfalls, prizes, discoveries, but sometimes the real encounter is with scale itself, with the terrifying calm of the sea, with the mind under pressure, with the question of who we are when there is no audience left to reassure us. Perhaps that is why such voyages hold us. They suggest that the farthest distances are not always measured in miles, but in the space between our confidence and our limits. It started in the polar night, where direction itself can feel uncertain and the world seems reduced to ice, wind, and endurance. In 1928, the airship Italia set out over the Arctic under the command of Umberto Nobile, pursuing one of the era's most alluring promises, that modern technology could finally master the planet's harshest frontiers. The expedition carried science, national pride, and the confidence of an age convinced that invention could tame distance. For a while, that confidence seemed justified. The Italia reached the North Pole and turned homeward, having done what explorers once could only imagine. But the Arctic has a way of punishing even small miscalculations. On the return journey, weather worsened. Ice gathered. Control faltered. Then the airship crashed onto the frozen expanse, scattering men and equipment across a landscape that gave nothing back. What followed was not a single disappearance, but a chain of them. Some survived the impact and waited in desperate isolation, sheltering in a tent stained red so rescuers might find them against the white. Others were swept away with the crippled remains of the airship as it lifted again, vanishing into the sky and never returning. Search missions launched from several countries. Pilots, sailors, and rescuers entered the same merciless environment in hopes of recovering the lost. Among them was the great Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen, who disappeared while flying north to help. One attempt to save explorers became another mystery layered upon the first. That is the Arctic's cruel logic. It does not merely test ambition, it multiplies consequence. One failure can call forth more courage, more sacrifice, more absence. The story stops being about a machine and becomes something older and more intimate, people refusing to abandon one another in a place almost designed to erase them. And maybe that is what gives the disaster its lasting weight. Not only the vanished airship or the men never found, but the human instinct to keep searching even when the landscape offers almost no hope. In the coldest places on Earth, what survives longest may not be certainty, but devotion. What if the most haunting discoveries are the ones that leave behind evidence, but no explanation? In the far north of Greenland, where rock, ice, and silence meet in uneasy balance, the story of ethnographer and explorer Knud Rasmussen carries that kind of weight. Rasmussen was not simply chasing conquest. He moved through the Arctic with a different ambition: to understand the people who had learned to live within one of the hardest environments on Earth, and to preserve their stories before the modern world erased them. His journeys across the polar regions were acts of listening as much as travel. He recorded myths, languages, memories, and ways of seeing the land that had been shaped over centuries. In that sense, he was exploring not only geography, but human knowledge itself. The Arctic for Rasmussen was never empty. It was inhabited by memory, technique, and cultural intelligence that outsiders often failed to recognize. Yet the farther north he traveled, the more uncertain the line became between observer and participant, scholar and wanderer. Expeditions in such regions depended on judgment, weather, timing, health, and luck. A broken route, a sudden illness, a change in ice conditions, any one of them could turn purpose into peril. Rasmussen survived many ordeals, but the larger world he documented was itself vanishing under pressure from colonial systems, disease, trade, and accelerating change. In a deeper sense, he was always moving through a landscape of disappearance. That may be why his legacy feels so resonant in a story like this. Not because he vanished into myth, in the literal way some explorers did, but because his work stands at the edge of another kind of loss, the disappearance of worlds that are not destroyed in one moment, but slowly thinned, renamed, and forgotten. He understood that exploration can wound as easily as it reveals. To arrive is never a neutral act. And so this chapter leaves us with a quieter question than survival alone. When we say something has been discovered, what do we really mean? That it was unknown to everyone, or only unknown to those with the power to record it? Sometimes the greatest mystery is not what the explorers found, but what the rest of the world failed to see until it was almost gone. It began with footprints in snow that should not have been there. In 1959, high in the northern Ural Mountains, a group of young hikers set out on a winter expedition that promised challenge, camaraderie, and the quiet satisfaction of testing themselves against the elements. They were experienced, disciplined, and by all accounts, prepared. They were not wandering into the unknown by accident. They chose difficulty on purpose, the way some people do when they are young enough to believe that skill and resolve can negotiate with danger. Then the mountain answered in a language no one could immediately understand. When searchers finally reached their abandoned tent, the scene carried the stillness of a sentence interrupted. The shelter had been cut open from within. Boots, clothing, and supplies remained behind. The hikers had fled into the freezing dark with astonishing haste, as though whatever frightened them had made thought itself impossible. Their bodies were later found scattered across the landscape, some near the tree line, some farther away, some showing injuries that seemed both terrible and strangely difficult to interpret. In the years that followed, explanations multiplied. Avalanche, wind-driven panic, snow slab collapse, infrasound, human error sharpened by weather and terrain. The case became famous precisely because it seemed to resist a single satisfying conclusion. That resistance invited fantasy. But perhaps the deeper unease comes from something simpler, the knowledge that nature does not always reveal its causes in ways we can easily narrate. Sometimes an event is not supernatural or conspiratorial. It is only fast, violent, and confusing enough to leave human beings behind in a state of unfinished understanding. That is why the story endures. Not because it proves the world is stranger than science, but because it reminds us that explanation often arrives late, partial, and fragile. We want every mystery to end with a door opening. Instead, some remain like that torn tent in the snow, evidence of a moment when ordinary people met fear all at once, and whatever happened next could only be reconstructed through silence. Maybe that is the hardest truth of all, not that the mountains keep secrets, but that our lives can change forever in a single, unseen instant, leaving others to piece together meaning from the cold. What if the earth could swallow a person not out of malice, but out of sheer indifference to how small we are inside it? Deep caves have always carried that feeling. They are places where sound changes shape, where light becomes a memory almost as soon as it leaves the entrance, where every step asks for trust. For many explorers, caves represent the last interior frontier, not a horizon in the distance, but a descent into the hidden anatomy of the planet itself. In the 20th century, several cavers and researchers entered such spaces in search of more than adventure. They were mapping passages, tracing underground rivers, documenting chambers no human record had described before. Yet caves do not behave like ordinary landscapes. They flood without mercy. They tighten unexpectedly. Air shifts, stone breaks. A route that seemed navigable on the way in can become impossible on the way out. Underground, time loses its familiar structure. Minutes stretch. Direction fragments. Fear becomes physical. Again and again, the pattern emerges. A team goes in with ropes, lamps, and confidence shaped by skill. Somewhere beyond the known section, something changes. A collapse, rising water, a wrong turn. Communication fails. Searchers follow, but the underground world resists rescue just as it resisted easy discovery. Sometimes a body is found, sometimes only equipment. Sometimes the cave keeps the final scene to itself, preserving no clean answer, only a narrowing chain of probabilities. There is a peculiar sadness to these stories because caves are not empty in the way oceans or deserts can seem empty. They feel intimate, close. The rock is within reach of your hands, and yet that closeness can be deceptive. Beneath the surface, the earth contains distances of another kind, vertical, twisting, absolute. A person may be only a few hundred feet from daylight and still be farther from rescue than if they were miles away in open country. Perhaps that is why cave disappearances linger in the imagination. They remind us that mystery does not always live at the far edge of the world. Sometimes it begins under our feet, in the dark places we enter, believing they can be measured. And perhaps every descent asks the same question in a different form. How much of the hidden world can we truly know before it changes us beyond return? It started with ice, but not the still kind. Glaciers move even when they appear frozen in thought, advancing grain by grain, hiding and releasing the past with maddening patience. For explorers drawn to polar regions and high mountains, ice has long held a double meaning. It preserves, it erases. A footprint may linger for hours or vanish in minutes. A body may be swallowed for decades, only to emerge years later as if time itself had lost track. That unstable promise drew generations north and upward. They crossed crevassed fields, snow bridges, and wind-carved ridges in search of routes, records, or knowledge. Some were climbers chasing summits. Others were scientists reading the frozen archive of the Earth. Still others were simply driven by the old human urge to stand where few had stood before. But glaciers are deceptive companions. Their surfaces suggest solidity while concealing fractures deep enough to end a life in a second. Many disappearances in ice country follow the same cruel rhythm. A team is moving well. Conditions are difficult but manageable. Then one step lands on what looks like ground and becomes emptiness. A climber breaks through a snow bridge, vanishes into blue darkness, and is gone before a rope can tighten. And in other cases, storms erase visibility, separating people by only a few yards that might as well be miles. Searchers return when weather clears, but by then the mountain has rearranged its evidence. Tracks are gone. Edges have collapsed. What remains is absence, precise and merciless. And yet there is something deeply human in our repeated return to those places. Ice fields and glaciers confront us with time on a scale that humbles personal ambition. They remind us that the world was old before we arrived and will remain complicated after we are gone. To walk on ice is to move across compressed centuries, over storms turned into layers, over winters stacked like unread pages. Maybe that is why these vanishings feel different from others. They are not only about danger, they are about memory itself. The ice keeps what it chooses, releases what it chooses, and in doing so, asks a haunting question. When the world remembers, imperfectly, how do we learn to live with the parts of the story that may never come back? What if the most important thing an explorer finds is not a place, but the realization that certainty is always temporary? Across deserts, oceans, mountains, and forests, that lesson returns with quiet force. There comes a moment in many expeditions when the original goal begins to blur. A mission to map a region becomes a struggle to survive it. A scientific survey turns into a confrontation with isolation. A search for hidden history becomes a mirror held up to the human mind, showing both its brilliance and its fragility. By the time we reach this point in the story, the pattern is unmistakable. Again and again, people have moved toward the unknown, carrying the best tools available to their time. Compasses, cameras, sledges, airships, radio sets, notebooks, satellite images, thermal gear. Each generation believes, at least for a while, that its instruments will close the distance between mystery and explanation. And each generation discovers, sooner or later, that knowledge does not abolish uncertainty. It only changes its shape. The missing explorer, then, becomes more than an individual. He or she becomes a symbol of the unfinished edge in all human understanding. Not a hero in the simplistic sense, not a martyr to ambition, but a reminder that discovery is rarely clean. It leaves behind traces, arguments, half-answers, a snapped line, a final signal, a camp left standing in silence. These fragments remain because the world does not tell its stories in full. We assemble them afterward, carefully, imperfectly, guided by evidence and by longing. Perhaps that is why these accounts endure beyond their facts. They speak to something older than curiosity alone. They touch the part of us that wants to believe meaning can still be found in uncertainty, that even an incomplete story may reveal something essential about being alive. To search is to admit that the world exceeds us. To keep searching, even after loss, is to admit that this excess is part of what makes life worth living. And so the mystery deepens into reflection. Perhaps the true frontier is not the hidden place itself, but our willingness to face what cannot be fully known, and still call the journey worthwhile. Imagine a ship holding perfectly still in a sea that appears to have no memory, no roads, no trees, no witness except wind and water. For maritime explorers, the ocean has always represented a strange contradiction. It is one of the oldest pathways on Earth and one of the least forgiving. It invites movement, trade, and discovery, yet at any moment it can erase the difference between a carefully planned voyage and a disappearance so complete it feels almost abstract. Many expeditions that vanished at sea did not do so in dramatic, cinematic fashion. There was no single visible catastrophe, no towering wave observed by survivors, no final scene to anchor the imagination. Instead, there were gaps. A vessel missed its scheduled arrival. A distress call never came. Debris surfaced in scattered pieces, too little to tell a full story. Search areas widened, clocks advanced, hope thinned. The ocean remained outwardly unchanged, as if nothing at all had happened. That indifference is what makes maritime disappearance so difficult to accept. On land, there are traces, tracks, ruins, campsites, broken branches. At sea, evidence disperses. Currents carry fragments into separate worlds. Storms rearrange chronology. Navigation logs end mid-thought. Even in the modern age of radar, sonar, and satellite tracking, the water still contains enormous blind spots. The more we learn to monitor the planet, the more humbling it becomes to realize how much of the surface of our own world can still absorb a human story without explanation. And yet people keep going back onto the water. They cross for research, for trade, for migration, for solitude, for the old, irresistible pull of distance. Perhaps that is because the sea does not only represent danger, it also represents connection. Civilizations met by crossing it. Ideas traveled over it. Families were separated by it and reunited through it. The same water that takes also carries. So when an explorer vanishes at sea, what lingers is not only fear, but a deeper reflection on trust. Every voyage begins with trust in a vessel, in weather, in skill, in luck, in the belief that a horizon can be crossed and crossed back again. And maybe that is why the ocean remains such a powerful stage for mystery, because it reminds us that every act of crossing is also an act of faith. It begins with a sound almost too small to notice: the click of a camera shutter, the scratch of a pen in a field notebook, the soft murmur of a voice recorder switched on in wind or rain. Long after an explorer disappears, these fragile remnants often remain. A photograph, a letter folded into a jacket pocket, coordinates written in haste. They are modest things, yet they become the final bridge between a vanished life and the world still trying to understand it. This is one of the quiet truths running beneath every story in this journey. Exploration is not only movement through unknown places, it is also an attempt to leave meaning behind. Even the most solitary traveler usually speaks to someone in the future: a colleague, a child, a stranger, a civilization not yet born. The notes say, "I was here." The images say, "Look carefully." The unfinished pages say, "There was more I meant to tell you." And sometimes those fragments alter history. A journal recovered from ice can revise what we thought we knew about an expedition's final days. Artifacts found in a jungle clearing can suggest that a so-called myth had roots in reality. A weathered camp, discovered decades later, can transform a disappearance from legend into a sequence of human decisions made under pressure. We do not always find the missing, but we often find the human texture around their absence. That texture matters. It returns dignity to uncertainty. Yet these traces also reveal how partial all memory is. A document preserves a moment, not the full interior life around it. A photograph captures light, not fear. A map records intention, not fate. We inherit evidence and build stories around it, but some essential portion always remains beyond reach. Perhaps that is not a failure of history. Perhaps it is history's deepest honesty. Because in the end, to remember someone is not to solve them. It is to keep company with what remains. A few objects, a route half finished, a question still alive. And maybe that is its own kind of rescue, not recovering every answer, but refusing to let silence be the final author of a human life. What if the deepest mystery is not why explorers vanish, but why the rest of us keep following them in our minds long after the trail ends? By now, the individual stories begin to merge into something larger than biography. Different centuries, different landscapes, different motives, and yet the same emotional pattern returns: departure, hope, uncertainty, silence. It is a rhythm almost ancient in itself, because it echoes something central to human life. We move forward without guarantees. We search without final proof. We love people we cannot fully protect. The explorer, in that sense, is not separate from us. He is an exaggerated version of an ordinary condition. She is what all human beings become when they choose to step beyond the familiar and trust that meaning may exist on the other side of risk. Some do this through travel, others through art, science, parenthood, illness, faith, reinvention. The terrain changes, but the emotional contract remains the same. To live deeply is to accept that not every journey offers closure. That may be why disappearance stories resist fading into mere historical curiosity. They sharpen our awareness of what it means to be unfinished. A vanished expedition is painful not only because lives were lost, but because intention was interrupted. The sentence was never completed. The last chapter was never dictated. And in that absence, we recognize something intimate, our own inability to know how any story, including our own, will finally resolve. Still, there is tenderness in the way memory responds. People keep searching archives. They study weather patterns, decode old notes, revisit landscapes, test assumptions, return to the evidence with patience rather than spectacle. Beneath all that labor is a simple human refusal to abandon one another to oblivion. Even decades later, someone still wants to know. Someone still wants to say, your life did not vanish just because the explanation did. Perhaps that is the quiet revelation waiting inside all these mysteries. The world is full of disappearances, but it is also full of remembrance. And sometimes the most enduring discovery is this, that our species is bound together not merely by what we find, but by the care with which we continue looking for one another through the dark. In the end, perhaps these stories were never only about the people who disappeared. Perhaps they were always about the rest of us, those who remain on the shore, at the archive table, under the museum light, listening for footsteps that will not return. We begin by asking what happened. But if we stay with these stories long enough, the question slowly changes. It becomes less about solving every absence and more about understanding what those absences reveal about the human need to search, to remember, and to make meaning from incomplete things. Across every landscape in this journey, the jungle canopy, the polar ice, the cave system, the open sea, the mountain in winter, one truth persists. The world is not fully arranged for our understanding. It offers beauty and danger in the same gesture. It invites inquiry, then withholds certainty. For generations, explorers stepped into that tension with courage that was sometimes noble, sometimes flawed, often both. They carried maps, cameras, notebooks, instruments, but beneath the tools was something older and more vulnerable. Faith that the unknown was worth approaching. That faith did not always save them, but it shaped the world the rest of us inherited. Because of such journeys, coastlines were drawn, species recorded, histories reconsidered, assumptions unsettled. And even where answers never came, the questions remained alive. In some cases, that may be the greater legacy. A mystery, carefully held, can deepen our humility. It can remind us that knowledge is not ownership, and that wonder is not a weakness of the mind, but one of its highest forms. So we end where all great disappearances leave us, at the threshold between fact and memory. We gather the fragments, we speak the names, we admit what we do not know, and then, perhaps, we see the larger human story more clearly. We are a species forever leaning toward the horizon, forever listening at the edge of silence, forever trying to understand a world that exceeds us. Maybe that is the final lesson. Not that every mystery must be solved, but that the search itself, the careful, hopeful reaching toward what lies beyond us, is one of the purest expressions of what it means to be human.